I thought I knew what betrayal felt like when my husband of 12 years told me he wanted a divorce. I thought I understood the sting of having someone you trusted turn their back on you without warning. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what my own lawyer would do to me. The man I paid thousands of dollars to protect my interests, to fight for my children, to secure my future, he sold me out for a bigger paycheck without blinking an eye. What he didn't count on was that I had been recording every single strategy session we ever had together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Martinez, and at 38 years old, I thought I had built a solid foundation for my life. I had been running my own marketing consultancy for the past 6 years, working with small businesses throughout the Denver area to help them grow their online presence. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was mine, and I was proud of what I had accomplished. My office was a converted bedroom in our Lakewood home, overlooking the Rockies, and on clear mornings I could see the snow-capped peaks that reminded me why Kevin and I had moved to Colorado in the first place. Kevin and I met in college at the University of Colorado Boulder. He was studying computer science while I was pursuing my degree in communications. We were both 22 when we graduated, and by 24 we were married in a small ceremony at Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs. Those early years felt like everything was falling into place exactly as it should. Kevin landed a job with a growing software company, I worked my way up through various marketing firms, and by our 5th wedding anniversary we had bought our first house. Sophie came along when I was 28. I still remember holding her tiny fingers in the hospital room, Kevin beside me with tears streaming down his face as he whispered about how perfect she was. 2 years later, Jake arrived, completing what I thought was our perfect little family. I had taken time off when each child was born, but I always returned to work, driven by my ambition to build something of my own. When Sophie turned 4 and Jake was 2, I made the leap to start my own business. Kevin supported the decision, even helping me set up the home office and cheering me on during those first uncertain months. For years, we fell into a comfortable rhythm. Kevin would leave for his downtown Denver office every morning at 7:30, coffee in hand and a quick kiss goodbye. I would get the kids ready for school, drop them off, and then settle into my office for the day. My client base grew steadily through word of mouth and referrals. Local restaurants, boutique shops, fitness studios, and service providers all needed help navigating the increasingly complex world of digital marketing. I specialized in creating authentic social media strategies that actually connected with real customers, not just impressive follower counts that meant nothing. The work fulfilled me in ways I hadn't expected. When Maria's Family Restaurant saw a 30% increase in customers after I redesigned their social media approach, I felt like I was making a real difference. When the yoga studio owner, Sarah, told me that my marketing campaign had helped her finally achieve her dream of expanding to a second location, I knew I had found my calling. My business wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. By my 6th year, I was booking clients 3 months in advance and had to turn down new projects. At home, things seemed equally solid. Kevin had been promoted twice and was leading a development team for a new project management software. Sophie was excelling in school, already showing signs of inherited perfectionism as she meticulously organized her homework every night. Jake was the athlete of the family, playing soccer in the fall and baseball in the spring, with an energy level that kept us all on our toes. We took family vacations to Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon, spent weekends hiking the trails around Boulder, and had established traditions like Friday night movie marathons and Sunday morning pancake breakfasts. But somewhere along the way, cracks began to form that I was too busy to notice. Kevin started working later, claiming his new project required extra hours. He became distant during our conversations, responding with short answers when I tried to discuss my day or the kids' activities. Our weekend hiking trips became less frequent, replaced by Kevin's sudden interest in weekend conferences and networking events. When I suggested we plan a romantic getaway for our 10th anniversary, he said the timing wasn't right with everything happening at work. The signs were there, but I rationalized every single one. Kevin was stressed about work. The software industry was competitive, and he was under pressure to deliver results. I told myself that this was just a phase, that once his current project launched, things would return to normal. I threw myself deeper into my own work, telling myself that if Kevin needed space to focus on his career, I would do the same with mine. I booked more clients, stayed up later working on campaigns, and convinced myself that we were both just dedicated professionals going through a busy period. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. How desperately I wanted to believe that the foundation we had built together was stronger than the growing distance between us. I kept thinking that if I just worked harder, earned more money, proved my value as a partner and provider, everything would stabilize. I even started putting aside extra money in a savings account, thinking we could surprise the kids with a bigger vacation. Or maybe finally renovate the kitchen Kevin had been talking about for years. The morning Kevin asked for a divorce, I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing a proposal for a new client, a local craft brewery that wanted to launch an ambitious social media campaign. It was a Tuesday in early March, one of those Colorado spring mornings where the sun was shining but snow was still possible by afternoon. Sophie and Jake had already left for school, and I was enjoying the quiet house and the strong coffee that helped me focus on complex strategy work. Kevin walked into the kitchen already dressed for work, but instead of grabbing his travel mug and heading for the door like usual, he sat down across from me. Something in his posture immediately set off alarm bells. His shoulders were tense, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. He kept fidgeting with his hands, a nervous habit I hadn't seen since our college days when he was stressed about exams. "Emma, we need to talk," he said, and those 4 words made my stomach drop. Nobody ever starts a conversation with, "we need to talk," when they're about to share good news. I closed my laptop and gave him my full attention, already bracing myself for whatever was coming. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," Kevin continued, still not looking directly at me. "About us, about our marriage, about what I want for the future. And I think we both know that things haven't been good between us for a while now." I wanted to interrupt, to argue that things weren't that bad, that we could work through whatever problems he was seeing. But something in his tone told me to let him finish, that interrupting would only make this harder for both of us. "I think we want different things now," he said. "We've grown apart, and I don't think we can fix it. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and I want to file for divorce." The words hit me like a physical blow. Divorce. The words seemed to echo in the quiet kitchen, bouncing off the walls and settling into every corner of the room. This was our kitchen, where we had fed our babies their first solid foods, where we had homework battles and birthday celebrations, where we had planned our dreams and shared our daily victories and frustrations. And now Kevin was sitting here, calmly dismantling 12 years of marriage like it was a failed business venture. "I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "When did you speak to a lawyer? Why didn't you talk to me first? I thought we could work through problems together." Kevin finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was worse than anger or frustration. It was indifference. Complete, cold indifference. As if I was a stranger he was delivering disappointing news to, rather than the woman he had promised to love for better or worse. "There's nothing to work through, Emma. I don't love you anymore. I haven't for a long time. I want different things now, and staying married to you isn't one of them." The brutality of his honesty was breathtaking. No gentle letdown. No suggestion that this was difficult for him too. No acknowledgement of everything we had built together. Just cold, clinical rejection delivered over morning coffee in the kitchen where we had shared thousands of meals and conversations. "What about Sophie and Jake?" I asked, grasping for something solid in the sudden chaos of my collapsing world. "What about our family?" "We'll figure out custody," Kevin said, as if we were discussing the division of household chores rather than the future of our children's lives. "I've already found an apartment downtown. I'll be moved out by the weekend." By the weekend. He had planned this entire conversation, made decisions about lawyers and apartments, and the dismantling of our family, and I was hearing about it for the first time on a Tuesday morning. The man I had shared a bed with for 12 years, who knew how I took my coffee and which side of the bed I preferred, and the names I had secretly picked out for the children we never had become a complete stranger. After Kevin left for work that morning, treating it like any other day, I sat alone in my kitchen and cried until my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw. But even in the midst of my shock and grief, a small voice in the back of my mind was already whispering warnings. Kevin had already spoken to a lawyer. He had already found an apartment. He had planned this entire exit strategy while continuing to share meals with me, sleep in the same bed, and act like a devoted father to our children. If he could orchestrate such an elaborate deception with someone he had promised to love and honor, what else was he capable of? What other surprises were waiting for me in the divorce proceedings he had already set in motion? I realized that morning that I couldn't afford to be naive anymore. The man I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone strategic and calculating enough to plan the destruction of our marriage while pretending everything was normal. That afternoon, I started researching divorce lawyers in Denver. I knew nothing about family law, nothing about custody battles or asset division or alimony calculations. I felt completely overwhelmed by the technical language and complex procedures I found in my online searches. All I knew was that I needed someone experienced, someone who could protect my interests and fight for my children when I didn't even understand the rules of the battle I was about to face. I called my best friend Lisa Chen, an accountant who had gone through her own divorce 3 years earlier. Lisa had always been the practical one in our friendship, the person who read every contract before signing and researched every major purchase until she knew more than the salesperson. If anyone would know how to navigate this nightmare, it would be Lisa. "Emma, I'm so sorry," Lisa said when I told her what had happened. "I know this is horrible right now, but you're going to get through this. And the first thing you need to do is find a really good lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone who specializes in high-asset divorces and custody cases." "High asset?" I asked. "We're not wealthy, Lisa. We have a house and some retirement savings, but we're not rich." "You own a successful business," Lisa reminded me. "That makes this complicated. Plus, Kevin works in tech, which means his income is probably going to increase significantly over the next few years. You need someone who understands business valuations and can make sure you're not getting screwed out of what you're..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Entitled to. Lisa gave me the names of 3 lawyers, but one stood out immediately. David Thompson, of Thompson and Associates Legal Group. Lisa had heard about him through her professional network, and his reputation was impressive. He had 25 years of experience in family law, specialized in complex financial cases, and had a track record of winning significant settlements for his clients, particularly women who owned their own businesses. I spent the rest of that week researching David Thompson online. His firm's website showcased case results that were nothing short of remarkable. He had secured a multi-million-dollar settlement for a woman whose husband had tried to hide assets in offshore accounts. He had won full custody for a mother whose ex-husband was a high-powered executive with expensive lawyers. He had successfully protected numerous women's business interests during divorce proceedings, ensuring they retained control of companies they had built from the ground up. The testimonials on his website read like victory stories from women who had been in situations similar to mine. "David Thompson saved my business and my relationship with my children," wrote one client. "He saw through my ex-husband's manipulation tactics and made sure I got what I deserved," wrote another. Reading these success stories gave me the first sense of hope I had felt since Kevin's announcement. David Thompson's office was located in a gleaming downtown Denver high-rise, the kind of building that screamed success and competence. The law firm occupied the entire 32nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of the Front Range. The reception area was elegantly appointed with leather furniture, original artwork, and fresh flowers that were clearly replaced weekly. Everything about the environment suggested that this was a firm that delivered results for clients who expected excellence. When I met David Thompson for the first time, I was immediately impressed by his presence. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with silver hair and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and spoke with a kind of confident authority that made you believe he could handle any challenge. His handshake was firm, his smile was warm, and his office was a testament to his success, filled with awards, photographs with local politicians and judges, and law books that actually looked like they had been read rather than displayed for show. "Mrs. Martinez," David said as he gestured for me to take a seat in one of the comfortable leather chairs facing his massive mahogany desk. "I've reviewed the preliminary information you provided, and I want you to know that you've come to the right place. Your situation is more common than you might think, and we have extensive experience protecting women like you during divorce proceedings." The phrase "women like you" immediately resonated with me. I wasn't just another client. I was part of a category that David understood and had successfully represented many times before. He explained that business-owning women faced unique challenges during divorce, particularly when their husbands worked in high-income industries like technology. Your husband's income trajectory in software development could be substantial over the next decade, David explained, pulling out charts and graphs that illustrated typical career earning patterns in Kevin's field. We need to make sure that any support arrangements account for his future earning potential, not just his current salary. Additionally, your business represents significant value that must be protected. I've seen too many women lose control of companies they built because they didn't have proper representation. David's analysis of my situation was thorough and impressive. He had already researched Kevin's employer and understood the equity compensation structure that was common in software companies. He explained how stock options and bonus structures could be hidden or manipulated during divorce proceedings, and how important it was to have someone who understood these complex financial instruments. I want to be completely transparent with you about costs, David said, sliding a fee agreement across his desk. My retainer is $15,000 and my hourly rate is $600. I know that sounds like a lot of money, but I want you to think of it as an investment in your future. The difference between good representation and excellent representation in a case like yours could easily be hundreds of thousands of dollars over time. The numbers made my head spin, but David's logic was compelling. If Kevin was really planning to fight me on custody and financial arrangements, I couldn't afford to have second-rate representation. My business was already generating six figures annually, and with proper protection, it could continue growing and supporting my family for years to come. $15,000 felt like an enormous expense, but losing custody of my children or being forced to sell my business would be devastating beyond any dollar amount. I signed the retainer agreement that afternoon, writing the largest check I had ever written to someone who wasn't a mortgage company. But as I walked out of David Thompson's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Kevin's announcement: confidence. I had an advocate now. Someone who understood the complexities of my situation and had the experience and track record to protect my interests. David immediately got to work on my case with an efficiency that impressed me. Within days, he had filed the necessary paperwork to establish temporary custody arrangements and ensure that neither Kevin nor I could make major financial decisions without court approval. He arranged for a forensic accountant to review our assets and Kevin's compensation structure. He even recommended a child psychologist who could help Sophie and Jake navigate the emotional challenges of their parents' divorce. During our second meeting, David outlined his strategy for my case. He had clearly spent considerable time analyzing every aspect of my situation, from the financial complexities to the emotional dynamics that would influence custody decisions. Your husband moved out of the family home and filed for divorce without attempting any form of marriage counseling or mediation, David explained. This works in our favor because it demonstrates that he was the one who chose to abandon the marriage. Additionally, the fact that he had already spoken to a lawyer and found an apartment before even discussing divorce with you shows premeditation that could influence support calculations. David's attention to detail extended beyond just the legal and financial aspects of my case. He understood that this divorce was happening to a real family with real children who needed stability and protection. He asked thoughtful questions about Sophie and Jake's routines, their relationships with each of their parents, and their adjustment to the news of the divorce. Children's best interests are always the court's primary concern in custody decisions, David explained. Your role as the primary caretaker, combined with your ability to maintain stability through your business income, puts you in a strong position. But we need to be prepared for your husband to argue that his higher income makes him better suited for primary custody. The idea that Kevin might try to take my children away from me was terrifying, but David's calm confidence helped ease my anxiety. He had handled hundreds of custody cases and understood exactly how to present my strengths while protecting against Kevin's potential arguments. I want you to start documenting everything, David advised. Every interaction with your husband, every conversation about the children, every financial transaction. Keep detailed records of your children's schedules, their activities, their emotional responses to the divorce. This documentation will be crucial if your husband tries to portray you as an unfit parent or claims that his involvement with the children was greater than it actually was. Following David's advice, I started keeping meticulous records of everything related to the divorce and the children. I bought a notebook specifically for this purpose and wrote down every phone call with Kevin, every pickup and drop-off for his visitation, every conversation with Sophie and Jake about their feelings. I saved every email and text message, photographed every document, and created digital backups of everything important. The documentation process was exhausting, but it also gave me a sense of control during a time when everything else felt chaotic. I was building a case, creating a record that would protect my children and my future. David had given me a roadmap to navigate this nightmare, and I was determined to follow every step with precision. As the weeks passed, I began to feel more optimistic about the outcome of my divorce. David Thompson was everything his reputation promised: knowledgeable, strategic, and completely dedicated to achieving the best possible result for his clients. I had made the right choice in hiring him, and despite the enormous emotional and financial costs of divorce, I was confident that my children and I would emerge from this process stronger and more secure than before. What I didn't know was that David Thompson was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. A call from a potential client whose case would be worth more money than mine could ever generate. A call that would test the loyalty and ethics of the man I was trusting with my children's future and my financial security. But I was completely unaware of what was coming. I walked into David's office for our weekly strategy session that Friday afternoon, armed with my notebook full of documentation and ready to discuss the next steps in my case. I had no idea that this would be the last time David Thompson would truly fight for my interests, because by the following Monday he would have a new priority that would make my case seem insignificant by comparison. The betrayal that was about to unfold would make Kevin's abandonment look like a minor disappointment. Because while I expected my husband to hurt me, I never imagined that the lawyer I was paying to protect me would become the person who inflicted the deepest wounds of all. The first sign that something was wrong came during what should have been a routine strategy meeting 3 weeks after I had hired David Thompson. I arrived at his office on a Wednesday morning, prepared to discuss the forensic accountant's preliminary findings about our marital assets. David's assistant, a polished woman named Rebecca who always greeted me with professional warmth, seemed distracted when I checked in for my appointment. "Mr. Thompson is running a few minutes behind," Rebecca said, not quite meeting my eyes. "He's just finishing up with another client. Would you mind waiting in the conference room instead of his office today?" It was an unusual request, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Law firms were busy places, and scheduling conflicts happened. I settled into the glass-walled conference room with my folder of documentation, reviewing my notes about Kevin's recent behavior and the children's adjustment to our new living arrangements. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see activity in the hallway that seemed more intense than usual. Associates were hurrying between offices carrying thick files, and I noticed several people I didn't recognize wearing expensive suits and carrying leather briefcases that screamed high-end legal representation. The energy in the office felt charged, like something significant was happening just beyond my view. When David finally arrived, nearly 20 minutes late, he looked different. His usual calm confidence had been replaced by something that seemed almost manic. His eyes were bright with excitement, and he moved with the quick, purposeful energy of someone who had just received incredibly good news. "Emma, I apologize for the delay," David said as he sat down across from me, but his tone lacked the focused attention I had grown accustomed to. "We've had some unexpected developments this morning that required immediate attention. But let's focus on your case. What did you think about the accountant's report?" I opened my folder and began discussing the findings, but I could tell David wasn't really listening. His eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, and twice he glanced at his phone when it buzzed with messages. When I mentioned a concerning discrepancy in Kevin's reported income versus his actual earning potential, David nodded absently without asking the follow-up questions that would normally prompt a strategic discussion. "That's very interesting," David said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but interesting. "We'll definitely want to explore that further. I think our next step should be to request additional financial documentation from your husband's employer." It was a generic response, the kind of thing any lawyer might say without actually engaging with the specifics of my situation. The David Thompson who had impressed me with his detailed analysis and strategic thinking seemed to have been replaced by someone going through the motions. "Is everything all right?" I asked, concerned that something might be wrong with another client's case or perhaps a family emergency. "You seem distracted today." David's attention snapped back to me with an almost guilty expression. "Of course, everything's fine. I'm completely focused on your case, Emma. Sometimes we just have multiple situations developing simultaneously, and it requires juggling priorities. But I want you to know that your case remains extremely important to me." The words were right, but something in his delivery felt hollow. The passionate advocate who had outlined my strategy with such precision just weeks earlier seemed to have lost some of his enthusiasm for my case. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that the stress of my divorce was making me oversensitive to every small change in people's behavior. Our meeting concluded 15 minutes earlier than usual, with David suggesting that we postpone our detailed discussion of custody strategy until the following week. "I want to give that topic the full attention it deserves," he explained, "and I'm afraid I have some urgent matters that need my immediate attention today." As I left the office, I passed a group of impeccably dressed people in the lobby who were clearly celebrating something significant. One woman, tall and elegant with perfectly styled blonde hair, was speaking in an animated voice about finally finding the right representation and, quote, moving forward with confidence. The group had the unmistakable aura of wealth and influence, the kind of clients who could afford to pay premium rates for premium service. Something about the scene made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. Perhaps it was the contrast between their obvious excitement and David's distracted demeanor during our meeting. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling that their celebration somehow related to the unusual energy I had noticed in the office. The following week, my concerns deepened when David's assistant called to reschedule our planned meeting. "Mr. Thompson has been called into an emergency hearing," Rebecca explained. "He's asked me to move your appointment to Friday afternoon instead of Wednesday morning." Emergency hearings were part of the legal business, and I understood that urgent matters sometimes took precedence over scheduled appointments. But when I arrived for the rescheduled meeting on Friday, I discovered that David had been called away again, this time for what Rebecca described as, quote, a critical negotiation session that couldn't be postponed. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience," Rebecca said, and I could tell she genuinely felt bad about the situation. "Mr. Thompson specifically asked me to let you know that he's working on something that will require his full attention for the next few days. But he wants to schedule a longer session with you early next week to make up for lost time." 2 cancellations in 1 week was unusual for a lawyer who had previously been extremely reliable about keeping scheduled appointments. When I asked Rebecca if there was another attorney in the firm who could answer some basic questions about my case, she hesitated before explaining that Mr. Thompson preferred to handle all communications with his clients personally. "He's very particular about maintaining continuity," Rebecca said. "He feels that having multiple attorneys involved can create confusion and mixed messages. He'll be back in touch early next week, I promise." I left the office feeling unsettled and frustrated. My divorce was moving forward whether David Thompson was available or not. Kevin had already submitted his financial disclosures, which contained several questionable elements that needed immediate challenge. The temporary custody schedule was causing problems for Sophie and Jake, who were struggling with the constant back and forth between houses. These issues required prompt attention, not delays caused by mysterious emergency situations. That weekend, I decided to do some research on my own. If David was too busy to address my immediate concerns, I could at least educate myself about the divorce process and understand what questions I should be asking. I spent hours online reading about Colorado divorce law, custody guidelines, and financial disclosure requirements. During my research, I stumbled across a recent article in the Denver Business Journal that made my blood run cold. The headline read, "Sterling Tech CEO Victoria Sterling announces divorce, hires top Denver family law attorney." The article went on to describe how Victoria Sterling, the 45-year-old founder and CEO of Sterling Technologies, had filed for divorce from her husband of 18 years, citing irreconcilable differences. Victoria Sterling was reportedly worth over $50 million, with her company valued at nearly $200 million. Her divorce was expected to be one of the most complex and high-profile family law cases in Colorado history, involving intricate business valuations, multiple properties, and international assets. The article mentioned that Sterling had retained the services of David Thompson from Thompson & Associates Legal Group, praising his reputation for handling, quote, sophisticated financial matters involving successful businesswomen. My stomach dropped as I read the article. The timeline matched perfectly with David's sudden unavailability and distracted behavior. The elegant blonde woman I had seen celebrating in the lobby must have been Victoria Sterling. While I had been sitting in the conference room waiting for my delayed meeting, David had been in his office signing a retainer agreement that would dwarf mine by hundreds of thousands of dollars. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't paranoid or oversensitive. David Thompson had taken on a case that would generate more legal fees in a month than my entire divorce would produce over the course of a year. No wonder his enthusiasm for my case had suddenly evaporated. No wonder he was too busy for our scheduled meetings. I had gone from being an important client to being a minor inconvenience in the span of a single phone call. I spent the rest of that weekend in a state of anxious uncertainty. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. Maybe David could handle both cases effectively without compromising his representation of my interests. Maybe his temporary unavailability was just an unfortunate coincidence that would resolve itself once he had the Sterling case properly organized. But deep down, I knew something fundamental had changed. The lawyer who had convinced me to pay $15,000 for his exclusive attention and strategic expertise was now dividing that attention with a client whose case was infinitely more lucrative than mine. Monday morning brought a call from Rebecca with another change to my schedule. Mr. Thompson would like to move your meeting from Wednesday to Friday, she said. He's been working around the clock on a very complex matter, and he wants to make sure he can give you his full attention when you meet. Rebecca, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional, I've been reading about the Sterling divorce case in the business news. Is that the complex matter that's been taking up so much of Mr. Thompson's time? There was a long pause before Rebecca responded, and when she did, her voice had lost its usual warmth. I'm not able to discuss other clients' cases, Mrs. Martinez. Mr. Thompson takes confidentiality very seriously. But I can assure you that he remains fully committed to achieving the best possible outcome in your situation. The corporate speak was a dead giveaway. Rebecca had been instructed on exactly how to respond to questions about David's other cases. The natural, conversational tone that had characterized our previous interactions had been replaced by carefully scripted language designed to deflect and reassure without actually providing any real information. I understand about confidentiality, I replied, but I'm concerned about whether Mr. Thompson has the bandwidth to properly represent my interests if he's simultaneously handling such a high-profile case. Maybe it would be better for me to work with another attorney in the firm who can give my case the attention it deserves. Oh no, Mrs. Martinez, that won't be necessary, Rebecca said quickly. Mr. Thompson has specifically requested that he continue as your primary counsel. He has extensive experience managing multiple complex cases simultaneously. This is just a temporary period of intensive work that will settle down very soon. The fact that David was insisting on keeping my case rather than transferring it to another attorney raised additional red flags. If he was truly too busy to give my case proper attention, the ethical thing to do would be to ensure I had adequate representation, even if that meant working with someone else in the firm. His insistence on maintaining control suggested that he didn't want to lose the revenue from my case, even if he couldn't provide the level of service I was paying for. When I finally met with David the following Friday, a full 2 weeks after our last substantive conversation, the change in his demeanor was unmistakable. He rushed through our meeting with an efficiency that felt more like an assembly line than strategic legal consultation. The detailed analysis and thoughtful questions that had characterized our early interactions had been replaced by quick assessments and generic advice. I've reviewed the financial disclosures your husband submitted, David said, flipping through the pages with barely a glance at the details. Everything looks fairly standard. We'll want to verify a few items, but I don't see any major red flags that would significantly impact our strategy. I stared at him in disbelief. The financial disclosures contained several obvious inconsistencies that even I had spotted during my own review. Kevin's reported salary was $10,000 lower than the figure he had mentioned to me just 6 months earlier. His stock option valuations seemed artificially deflated. His expense reports included items that didn't match our actual family spending patterns. "David, what about the stock option discrepancy I mentioned in my email?" I asked. "Kevin's employer went public last year, and his options should be worth significantly more than what he's reporting." David nodded absently while checking something on his phone. "Yes, stock options can be tricky to value. We'll have our accountant take a closer look at that. But these things often work themselves out during the discovery process." It was exactly the kind of passive, wait-and-see approach that David had criticized when I first hired him. During our initial consultation, he had emphasized the importance of aggressive investigation and immediate challenges to questionable financial disclosures. Now he was suggesting that we simply trust the process and hope that Kevin's potential deception would somehow resolve itself. "I'm also concerned about the custody schedule," I continued. "Sophie has been having nightmares since the divorce started, and the constant transitions between houses seem to be making it worse. I think we need to request a modification that provides more stability." "Custody modifications during the temporary phase can be complicated," David replied, still not giving me his full attention. "Unless there's evidence of immediate danger to the children, judges generally prefer to maintain the status quo until the final decree. We don't want to appear overly demanding or unreasonable." Again, this was completely contrary to the approach David had outlined when I first retained his services. He had specifically told me that protecting my children's emotional well-being was a top priority, and that he would aggressively pursue any modifications necessary to ensure their stability and safety. As our meeting concluded after just 30 minutes, I felt more confused and frustrated than I had at any point since Kevin had asked for the divorce. I was paying $600 an hour for legal representation, but I was receiving advice that seemed generic and passive. The advocate who had promised to fight aggressively for my interests had apparently lost his enthusiasm for fighting. Walking out of David's office, I made a decision that would prove to be the most important choice of my entire divorce process. I was going to start recording our conversations, not because I planned to do anything illegal or unethical, but because I needed to document what was happening to my case. If David Thompson was providing substandard representation because of his involvement with a more lucrative client, I wanted evidence of that fact. I had been keeping detailed written notes throughout the divorce process, but written notes could be dismissed as biased interpretations of conversations. Audio recordings would provide objective documentation of exactly what was said and how it was said. If I eventually needed to file a complaint against David or prove that I had received inadequate representation, the recordings would be invaluable evidence. Colorado is a one-party consent state, which meant that I could legally record conversations as long as I was a participant. I wasn't planning to secretly record David without his knowledge for purposes of entrapment or manipulation. I was simply protecting myself by creating an accurate record of the legal advice I was receiving and paying for. The next week, I downloaded a voice recording app on my phone and tested it to make sure it would capture clear audio during my meetings with David. The app was designed for business professionals who needed to record meetings and conferences, and it produced high-quality recordings that could be easily stored and organized. During my next appointment with David, I placed my phone on the conference table between us and casually mentioned that I was recording our conversation for my own notes. "I hope you don't mind," I said. "I want to make sure I remember all the details of your advice correctly." David barely glanced at the phone and nodded his approval. "Of course, that's fine. I always encourage clients to take thorough notes." What David didn't realize was that his casual consent to being recorded would eventually provide me with documented evidence of how dramatically his representation of my case had deteriorated. Over the next several weeks, I would capture audio proof of missed deadlines, ignored red flags, and advice that directly contradicted his earlier strategic recommendations. But even more damaging than what David said during our recorded conversations was what he didn't say. The recordings would document his lack of engagement, his distracted responses, and his failure to ask the probing questions that had characterized his early involvement in my case. As I sat in my car after that meeting, looking up at the gleaming high-rise that housed David Thompson's office, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. I had trusted this man with the most important legal matter of my life. I had paid him a substantial retainer based on his promises of aggressive advocacy and personalized attention. And now I was reduced to secretly recording our conversations to protect myself from his neglect. But I wasn't going to be a victim of David Thompson's greed and unethical behavior. I was going to document every conversation, every missed deadline, every piece of advice that seemed designed to minimize his workload rather than maximize my outcome. And when the time was right, I was going to use that evidence to hold him accountable for betraying the trust I had placed in him. The war for my family's future was about to become a battle on two fronts. I would have to fight Kevin for custody and financial security while simultaneously protecting myself from the lawyer I was paying to be my advocate. It was a challenge I had never anticipated, but I was determined to emerge victorious on both fronts. What David Thompson didn't understand was that underestimating me would be the biggest mistake of his legal career. He thought he could take my money while giving his attention to a more profitable client. He thought I would quietly accept substandard representation rather than make waves that might complicate his lucrative new case. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. The betrayal that I had been suspecting for weeks finally revealed itself in the most devastating way possible during what was supposed to be a crucial settlement negotiation. Kevin and his attorney had proposed a custody and financial arrangement that was so one-sided it bordered on insulting, and I had been counting on David to aggressively counter their ridiculous offer. Instead, I discovered that my own lawyer had been working behind the scenes to pressure me into accepting terms that would benefit everyone except me and my children. The morning of the settlement conference, I arrived at David's office an hour early to review our strategy and make sure we were prepared for every possible scenario. Kevin's proposal would give him primary custody of Sophie and Jake, despite the fact that I had been their primary caretaker throughout their entire lives. He was offering me minimal alimony for just 3 years, claiming that my business income made long-term support unnecessary. Most insulting of all, he wanted me to buy out his share of our family home at an artificially inflated appraisal value, while simultaneously demanding half the value of my marketing business. David had assured me during our previous meeting that Kevin's proposal was a starting point for negotiations, not a serious offer that anyone would expect me to consider. "This is exactly the kind of aggressive opening move we anticipated," he had said. "We'll counter with our own demands that protect your parental rights and financial interests." Settlement conferences are about finding middle ground, not capitulating to unreasonable demands. But when I arrived at his office that morning, David seemed nervous and distracted in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. He kept checking his phone, glancing at his watch, and fidgeting with papers on his desk without actually reviewing the materials relevant to my case. "Emma, before we head into the conference, I want to discuss some practical considerations about your position," David said, his tone more cautious than I had ever heard before. "I've been thinking about Kevin's proposal, and while it's certainly aggressive, there might be some strategic advantages to finding common ground rather than engaging in a protracted battle." I stared at him in disbelief. Strategic advantages? David, his proposal would give me minimal time with my own children and leave me financially devastated. Where exactly do you see advantages in that scenario? David cleared his throat and opened a folder that contained what appeared to be carefully prepared talking points. "Well, custody battles can be extremely expensive and emotionally damaging for children. If we can reach an agreement that provides you with meaningful parenting time, while avoiding a drawn-out fight, that might be better for everyone involved, especially Sophie and Jake." The language he was using sounded like it had been crafted by Kevin's attorney rather than my own advocate. Meaningful parenting time was legal speak for less than primary custody. The beau trin. Emphasis on avoiding expense and emotional damage seemed designed to discourage me from fighting for what I deserved, rather than protecting my interests. "David, 2 months ago you told me that my role as primary caretaker and my stable income from the business made me an ideal candidate for primary custody," I said, pulling out my notebook where I had recorded his exact words. "You said that fathers who abandon the family home and file for divorce without attempting reconciliation rarely get primary custody unless there are extenuating circumstances. What's changed?" David's discomfort was palpable as he avoided making direct eye contact. "Every case evolves as new information becomes available. Kevin's attorney has provided additional details about his work schedule and child care arrangements that might influence a judge's perspective. Sometimes the most advantageous strategy is to secure the best possible terms within the framework of what's realistically achievable." Again, the language sounded like it had been borrowed from opposing counsel. Kevin's work schedule had always involved long hours and frequent travel, which was why I had been the parent handling school pickups, doctor appointments, homework supervision, and extracurricular activities. The idea that new information about his availability somehow favored his custody claim was absurd. "What additional details?" I asked. "Kevin travels at least twice a month for work, often for entire weeks. He's never been to a parent-teacher conference or taken the kids to a medical appointment. What could his attorney possibly have told you that would change the fundamental facts about our parenting arrangements?" David shuffled through his papers with obvious discomfort. "Well, he's indicated that he's willing to modify his work schedule to accommodate increased parenting responsibilities. He's also prepared to hire a full-time nanny to ensure proper childcare during his work hours." The suggestion that Kevin could suddenly transform into an engaged, available parent by hiring help was laughable, but David was presenting it as if it was a legitimate argument for changing custody arrangements. More troubling was his apparent acceptance of Kevin's claims without any verification or challenge. "David, you told me that sudden promises to change work schedules and lifestyle patterns are exactly the kind of manipulation tactics that judges see through," I said, referring to another conversation I had carefully documented. "You said that custody decisions should be based on historical patterns of involvement, not future promises that can't be verified." The contradiction between David's current advice and his earlier strategic guidance was so stark that it couldn't be explained by evolving circumstances or new information. Something had fundamentally changed in his approach to my case, and that change was clearly not in my favor. As we walked to the conference room where Kevin and his attorney were waiting, David made one more attempt to lower my expectations and reduce my demands. "Emma, I want you to consider the possibility that compromise might serve your long-term interests better than conflict. Protracted litigation is expensive, unpredictable, and emotionally exhausting. Sometimes accepting less than perfect terms in exchange for certainty and closure is the wisest choice." His words felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than Kevin's original request for divorce. Kevin was my adversary in this process. I expected him to pursue his own interests at my expense. But David was supposed to be my advocate, my protector, my voice in a system I didn't understand. Instead, he was actively encouraging me to surrender without fighting for what I deserved. The settlement conference itself was even worse than I had anticipated. Kevin's attorney, Michael Rodriguez, presented their position with confidence and aggression, outlining detailed justifications for every aspect of their proposal. He had prepared charts showing Kevin's earning potential, research about the impact of custody battles on children, and arguments about my business's ability to generate sufficient income to support my independent lifestyle. David's response was shockingly passive. Rather than challenging the assumptions underlying Kevin's proposal or presenting strong counter-arguments, he asked clarifying questions that seemed designed to understand their position rather than attack its weaknesses. When Michael Rodriguez claimed that Kevin's travel schedule was becoming less demanding due to company restructuring, David nodded thoughtfully instead of demanding documentation or verification. "That's interesting," David said when Rodriguez finished his presentation. "It sounds like Kevin has really thought through the practical aspects of increased parenting responsibility. Emma, what are your thoughts about the childcare arrangements he's proposing?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. David was asking for my thoughts as if he was a neutral mediator, rather than my advocate. He should have been attacking every weak point in Kevin's proposal, not soliciting my opinion about whether I found it acceptable. "My thoughts are that Kevin has never demonstrated any interest in hands-on parenting," I said, looking directly at Rodriguez while speaking loudly enough for David to understand that I expected him to support my position. "He's promising changes that he has no track record of implementing. I don't think promises about future behavior should outweigh 12 years of established patterns." David's response was another shock. Instead of building on my point or providing legal arguments to support it, he seemed to distance himself from my position. "Of course, Emma's concerns about historical patterns are understandable," he said to Rodriguez. "But people do sometimes make significant life changes during major transitions like divorce. The question is whether there's a framework for ensuring that promised changes actually occur." He was legitimizing Kevin's position while minimizing mine. Rather than arguing that Kevin's promises were irrelevant compared to established facts, David was suggesting that the promises might be valid if properly structured. He was negotiating against my interests while pretending to represent them. When Rodriguez proposed a custody schedule that would give Kevin primary physical custody with me receiving alternating weekends and 1 weeknight per week, David didn't immediately reject it as unacceptable. Instead, he asked questions about holiday schedules and summer vacation arrangements, as if the fundamental premise was worth discussing. "The schedule seems workable from a practical standpoint," David said. "Emma, you mentioned that your business requires some flexibility in your daily routine. Would this arrangement allow you to maintain your professional commitments while ensuring quality time with Sophie and Jake?" Again, he was framing Kevin's proposal as potentially beneficial for me, rather than devastating to my relationship with my children. The suggestion that reduced custody would help my business was particularly insulting, since I had made it clear that my children were my top priority and that I was willing to modify my work schedule to accommodate their needs. The financial discussion was equally troubling. When Rodriguez argued that my business income eliminated the need for substantial alimony, David didn't challenge the underlying assumptions about business valuation or income predictability. When Rodriguez suggested that I should bear the entire cost of buying out Kevin's share of our home equity, David asked questions about financing options, rather than arguing that the proposal was fundamentally unfair. "I think there might be some creative solutions here," David said to Rodriguez. "If Emma can secure financing for the home buyout, that would give Kevin immediate liquidity while allowing Emma to maintain stability for the children. It's a win-win scenario that serves everyone's interests." Except it wasn't a win-win scenario. It was a win-lose scenario, where Kevin got immediate cash while I took on additional debt and financial risk. David was presenting Kevin's demands as reasonable solutions, rather than one-sided proposals that benefited my ex-husband at my expense. As the conference progressed, I began to understand that I was facing not one adversary but two. Kevin and his attorney were openly working against my interests, which was expected and appropriate. But David was also working against my interests while pretending to represent them, which was both unexpected and completely unethical. During a brief recess, I confronted David about his approach. "Why aren't you fighting for me?" I asked. "Everything you're saying sounds like you think Kevin's proposal is reasonable, but 2 months ago you told me it was exactly the kind of aggressive opening move that we should reject immediately." David looked uncomfortable but maintained his position. "Emma, I'm trying to find solutions that serve your long-term interests. Sometimes that means recognizing when the other side has made reasonable points and working with them rather than against them. Adversarial approaches don't always produce the best outcomes." His explanation made no sense. Kevin's proposal served Kevin's long-term interests, not mine. Working with the other side was appropriate when they made legitimate concessions or acknowledged valid concerns. But Kevin hadn't conceded anything or acknowledged any of my concerns. David was encouraging cooperation with a completely one-sided proposal. "What about Sophie and Jake?" I asked. "How does reducing my time with them serve their long-term interests? How does forcing me to take on debt to buy out Kevin's share of our home help create stability for them?" David's response was another indication that something was fundamentally wrong with his representation. "Children are resilient, Emma. What matters most is that both parents remain actively involved in their lives, and that the financial arrangements are sustainable for everyone. This proposal ensures both of those outcomes." The suggestion that children were resilient enough to handle reduced time with their primary caretaker was contrary to everything David had told me about the importance of stability and continuity. His new position seemed designed to rationalize Kevin's demands rather than protect my children's best interests. When the settlement conference resumed, I made the decision to advocate for myself since my own attorney had apparently abandoned that responsibility. When Rodriguez made additional arguments about Kevin's superior financial position, I interrupted to point out inconsistencies in his financial disclosures. When he claimed that Kevin's work schedule was becoming more flexible, I provided specific examples of recent business trips that contradicted his claims. David's reaction to my active participation was telling. Rather than supporting my challenges to Kevin's position, he seemed embarrassed by my assertiveness. He made comments about maintaining a, quote, collaborative tone and suggested that aggressive questioning might undermine our negotiating position. But my willingness to fight for myself produced immediate results that David's passive approach had failed to achieve. When I challenged Rodriguez's claims about Kevin's income, he was forced to admit that the figures were based on projections rather than actual earnings. When I questioned Kevin's commitment to reduced travel, Rodriguez acknowledged that his work obligations hadn't actually changed yet. Emma raises some valid points about documentation and verification, Rodriguez said to David, as if he expected my own attorney to help him address my concerns. Maybe we should schedule a follow-up meeting once Kevin can provide more concrete information about his work situation. David's response was the final confirmation of what I had been suspecting for weeks. Instead of seizing on the momentum I had created to press for better terms, he suggested that we adjourn the conference to, quote, allow everyone time to consider the various options that have been discussed. He was treating Kevin's inadequately supported proposal as a legitimate starting point for future negotiations, rather than an opening position that had been successfully challenged. He was giving Kevin time to strengthen his arguments instead of demanding immediate concessions based on the weaknesses I had exposed. As we left the conference room, I felt a combination of fury and determination that I had never experienced before. Kevin's betrayal had been painful but expected. David's betrayal was infuriating and completely unacceptable. I was paying him to fight for me, and instead he was actively undermining my position while collecting $600 an hour for the privilege. Walking back to David's office, I activated the recording app on my phone and placed it prominently on his desk. I want to discuss what just happened in there, I said. I need to understand why you seem to be advocating for Kevin's position instead of mine. David's discomfort was obvious as he realized I was creating a record of our conversation. Emma, I understand that you're frustrated, but I want you to trust that I'm working in your best interests. Sometimes effective advocacy means finding common ground rather than fighting battles that can't be won. What battles can't be won? I asked. You told me 2 months ago that I had strong claims for primary custody and substantial alimony. You said Kevin's financial disclosures contained questionable elements that we would aggressively challenge. What's changed that makes those battles unwinnable now? David's attempt to answer my question revealed the depth of his betrayal. Well, Kevin's attorney has presented some compelling arguments about his commitment to active parenting, and the financial analysis is more complex than we initially anticipated. Sometimes cases don't develop the way we expect them to. He was trying to convince me that Kevin's unsupported promises constituted compelling arguments. He was suggesting that financial complexity justified accepting unfavorable terms rather than demanding proper analysis. He was rewriting the history of his own strategic advice to rationalize his current abandonment of my interests. David, I've been recording our conversations for the past month, I said, watching his face for a reaction. I have audio documentation of every piece of advice you've given me, every strategy you've recommended, and every assessment you've made of my case. Would you like me to play back what you said about Kevin's custody prospects and financial disclosure obligations? The change in David's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The casual dismissiveness that had characterized his recent approach to my case was replaced by sharp attention and obvious concern. He understood that I had evidence of his contradictory advice and declining advocacy. Emma, I think you may be misunderstanding the natural evolution of legal strategy, David said, his voice more careful than I had heard in weeks. As new information becomes available and circumstances change, effective representation requires adapting our approach. What matters is achieving the best possible outcome given current realities. But I was no longer interested in his explanations or justifications. I had documented evidence of his betrayal, and I was going to use that evidence to protect myself and my children from his continued negligence. The current reality is that you've stopped fighting for me, I said. The current reality is that you're encouraging me to accept terms that you previously told me were unacceptable. The current reality is that I'm paying you to advocate for Kevin's interests instead of mine. David tried one more time to regain control of the situation. Emma, I understand that you're upset, but I want to assure you that I remain completely committed to achieving the best possible outcome for you and your children. Perhaps we should schedule a longer meeting next week to discuss your concerns in detail and make sure we're aligned on strategy going forward. But I was done with meetings, discussions, and reassurances. I was done with a lawyer who had betrayed my trust and abandoned his responsibilities. I was done with paying for representation that was actually working against my interests. "There won't be a next week, David," I said, standing up to leave. "I'm terminating your representation effective immediately. I'll be requesting a full accounting of how my retainer has been spent and a refund of any unused portion. And I'll be filing complaints with the state bar about your unethical conduct." As I walked out of David Thompson's office for the last time, I felt a mixture of fear and liberation. I was facing divorce proceedings without legal representation, but I was also free from a lawyer who had been actively sabotaging my case. I had recordings that documented his betrayal, and I was determined to use them to hold him accountable while protecting other women from experiencing the same violation of trust. The war for my family's future was far from over, but at least now I knew who my real enemies were, and I was prepared to fight them all. The truth about David Thompson's betrayal came to light in a way that exceeded even my worst suspicions about his unethical conduct. 3 days after I fired him, I received an unexpected phone call from someone who would provide me with evidence that David's abandonment of my case was not just negligent, but deliberately calculated to benefit his more lucrative client at my expense. The caller identified herself as Jennifer Walsh, a paralegal who had recently left Thompson and Associates under circumstances she described as ethically problematic. Jennifer had read about my complaints against David in the legal community gossip that circulated among Denver law firms, and she felt compelled to share information that would expose the full scope of his misconduct. "Mrs. Martinez, I worked on both your case and the Sterling divorce," Jennifer said, her voice shaking with what sounded like a combination of anger and fear. "What David did to you was deliberate and systematic. I have documentation that proves he intentionally sabotaged your representation to avoid any conflicts with strategies he was using for Victoria Sterling." Jennifer explained that she had been David's primary paralegal for 3 years, and it helped him build his reputation for successfully representing businesswomen in complex divorce cases. She had always respected his aggressive advocacy and ethical standards, until Victoria Sterling became a client, and everything changed overnight. The day Victoria Sterling signed her retainer agreement, David called a staff meeting where he explicitly told everyone that the Sterling case was now our top priority, Jennifer revealed. He said that the fees from that case would be enough to fund the entire firm's operations for 2 years, and that every other case should be managed to avoid any interference with our Sterling obligations. The casual way David had discussed subordinating his other clients' interests to accommodate Victoria Sterling was shocking enough, but Jennifer's next revelation was even more damaging. David had specifically identified my case as potentially problematic because both Victoria Sterling and I were businesswomen seeking primary custody and substantial financial settlements from husbands in high-earning professions. David was worried that if you achieved a precedent-setting victory in your custody case, it might complicate Victoria's negotiations, Jennifer explained. Victoria's husband was planning to argue that her business responsibilities made her unsuitable for primary custody. If you won primary custody despite being a business owner, it would undermine that entire line of argument. The strategic connection between my case and Victoria Sterling's was something I had never considered, but it made perfect sense in hindsight. Both of our divorces involved successful women who ran their own companies while seeking custody of their children from husbands who worked in demanding, high-travel professions. Legal precedents established in one case could directly influence negotiations and court decisions in similar cases. Jennifer had documented evidence of David's deliberate strategy to minimize my case to benefit Victoria Sterling. I have emails where David specifically instructed other attorneys in the firm to avoid aggressive advocacy in business owner custody cases until the Sterling matter was resolved, she said. He didn't want any conflicting precedents or strategic complications that might hurt his most valuable client. The level of calculation involved in David's betrayal was breathtaking. He hadn't simply gotten distracted by a more lucrative case. He had deliberately sacrificed my interests to protect his ability to generate maximum fees from Victoria Sterling. Every piece of passive advice, every suggestion that I accept unfavorable terms, every failure to challenge Kevin's weak arguments, had been part of a coordinated strategy to ensure that my case didn't interfere with his primary source of revenue. Jennifer also revealed that David had been sharing information about my case with Victoria Sterling's legal team to help them prepare for potential arguments about business ownership and custody. He would tell Victoria's attorneys about strategies that Kevin's lawyer was using successfully against you, Jennifer said. He was basically giving them a preview of arguments they might face and helping them develop counter-strategies. The violation of attorney-client privilege was staggering. Not only had David failed to advocate effectively for my interests, but he had actually used confidential information from my case to benefit another client. He had turned my legal struggles into research material for Victoria Sterling's advantage. I started keeping copies of everything after I realized what was happening, Jennifer continued. I have emails, meeting notes, billing records, and strategy documents that prove David deliberately undermined your representation. I was hoping someone would file a formal complaint so I could provide this evidence to the state bar. Jennifer's documentation would be crucial for any formal action against David, but she also provided me with information that was immediately relevant to my ongoing divorce case. She had access to internal assessments of my case that David had never shared with me, including positive evaluations of my custody prospects and financial claims. David's real analysis of your case was completely different from what he told you, Jennifer revealed. Internal memos showed that he thought you had excellent prospects for primary custody and that Kevin's financial disclosures were obviously manipulated. He was telling other attorneys that your case was a slam dunk for everything you were seeking. The contrast between David's private assessment and his public advice to me was infuriating. While encouraging me to accept minimal custody and inadequate financial support, he had been telling colleagues that I should easily win everything I was fighting for. His pessimistic counseling had been designed to manage my expectations downward, not to provide honest evaluation of my legal position. Jennifer also had evidence about the Sterling case that explained David's motivation for sacrificing my interests. Victoria Sterling's divorce involved assets worth over $50 million, and David's fee arrangement entitled him to a percentage of any settlement above certain thresholds. A successful outcome in the Sterling case could generate more money for David personally than his entire firm had earned in the previous year. Victoria Sterling was paying David a base fee of $200,000, plus additional contingency fees tied to the final settlement amount, Jennifer explained. If he could secure a settlement above $30 million, he would receive bonus payments that could total another $300,000. Your entire case was worth maybe $50,000 in fees, so you can see why he prioritized her interests over yours. The financial incentive for David's betrayal was crystal clear. By ensuring that my case didn't create legal precedents or strategic complications that might hurt Victoria Sterling's position, David was protecting his opportunity, benefit. But Jennifer's most damaging revelation concerned David's active coordination with Kevin's attorney to ensure that my case resolved quickly and quietly. David was actually coaching Michael Rodriguez on arguments that would be most effective against you, she said. He would suggest lines of questioning and legal theories that Kevin's side should pursue. The idea that my own attorney had been secretly helping Kevin's lawyer was almost too shocking to believe. But Jennifer had email evidence of their collaboration. David had provided Rodriguez with insights about my personality, my priorities, and my likely responses to different negotiating tactics. He had essentially given Kevin's attorney a playbook for manipulating me into accepting unfavorable terms. There's one email where David tells Rodriguez that you're very focused on the children's emotional well-being, and that emphasizing the stress of prolonged litigation would be an effective way to pressure you into settling quickly, Jennifer said. He was basically teaching Kevin's lawyer how to exploit your parental concerns against you. The strategic advice that David provided to my opposition explained several confusing aspects of Kevin's behavior during our divorce proceedings. Kevin's sudden emphasis on avoiding emotional trauma for the children, his lawyer's focus on the costs and uncertainty of litigation, and their coordinated pressure for rapid settlement had all originated from suggestions provided by my own attorney. Jennifer also revealed that David had been deliberately delaying progress on my case to buy time for the Sterling negotiations to conclude. He instructed me to slow down discovery requests, postpone depositions, and find excuses to delay any hearings or deadlines in your case, she said. He wanted to make sure that Victoria Sterling's divorce was finalized before anything significant happened in your proceedings. The pattern of canceled meetings, postponed deadlines, and delayed responses that had frustrated me throughout David's representation had been part of a coordinated strategy to subordinate my case to his more valuable client. Every excuse about emergency hearings or urgent matters for other clients had been fabricated to justify his neglect of my legal needs. Beyond the documented evidence of David's misconduct, Jennifer provided me with practical information that would help me rebuild my legal strategy with new representation. She had copies of research that David's firm had conducted about Kevin's employer, analysis of his compensation structure, and assessments of his actual earning potential that painted a very different picture from what Kevin had disclosed. Kevin's stock options are worth nearly twice what he reported, Jennifer told me. David had ordered a complete analysis of his compensation package, but he never shared the results with you because it would have required aggressive action that might have delayed your case resolution. The suppressed research would be invaluable for challenging Kevin's financial disclosures and securing appropriate support arrangements. Jennifer also had documentation of Kevin's travel schedule and work commitments that contradicted his claims about increased availability for parenting responsibilities. David's investigator found evidence that Kevin's company is actually expanding their international operations, which means his travel requirements are increasing rather than decreasing, Jennifer revealed. But David instructed the investigator not to prepare a formal report because he didn't want evidence that would strengthen your custody position. The systematic suppression of evidence that supported my case was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of David's betrayal. He hadn't simply failed to advocate effectively. He had actively concealed information that would have helped me achieve better outcomes for myself and my children. Jennifer's decision to contact me had been motivated by her growing discomfort with David's unethical behavior, but she had finally been compelled to act when she learned about additional victims. "You're not the only client David has sacrificed for the Sterling case," she said. "There are at least 3 other women whose cases have been compromised to avoid any interference with Victoria Sterling's divorce." The scope of David's misconduct extended far beyond my individual situation. He had apparently developed a systematic approach to managing his caseload that prioritized the most lucrative cases while deliberately undermining clients who posed potential conflicts or complications. "I have evidence about all of these cases," Jennifer said. David has been collecting fees from multiple clients while providing minimal representation designed to ensure quick, quiet resolutions that won't interfere with his primary moneymaker. The pattern of behavior that Jennifer described constituted a massive ethical violation that would be of significant interest to the State Bar Association. David had essentially been operating a fraudulent scheme where he collected full fees from multiple clients while providing services only to the one who generated the most revenue. But Jennifer also warned me about the challenges I would face in pursuing formal action against David. "Victoria Sterling's case is scheduled to conclude within the next month," she said. "Once David secures his massive fee from that settlement, he'll have the resources to hire the best defense attorneys in Colorado to fight any complaints against him. The timing of my action against David would be crucial. If I waited too long to file formal complaints, he would have both the motivation and the resources to mount a sophisticated defense that could delay or complicate any disciplinary proceedings." Jennifer had already consulted with an attorney about her own potential liability for providing me with confidential information from David's firm. "My lawyer says that I have whistleblower protection because I'm reporting unethical conduct that harmed clients," she explained. "But David will definitely try to retaliate against me for exposing his behavior." The personal risk that Jennifer was taking to provide me with evidence of David's misconduct made her information even more credible and valuable. She had nothing to gain and potentially much to lose by revealing David's unethical behavior, which meant her motives were clearly focused on preventing further harm to his victims. Armed with Jennifer's documentation and insider knowledge about David's systematic betrayal, I finally understood the full scope of what had been done to me. David Thompson hadn't simply been a distracted or incompetent attorney who had failed to provide adequate representation. He had been a calculating manipulator who had deliberately sacrificed my family's future to maximize his own financial benefit. The recordings I had made of our conversations would provide evidence of his contradictory advice and declining advocacy, but Jennifer's documents would prove that his behavior was intentional rather than merely negligent. Together, the audio and paper evidence would create an overwhelming case for professional discipline and potential civil liability. But more importantly, Jennifer's information gave me the tools I needed to rebuild my divorce case with new legal representation. The suppressed research about Kevin's finances, the documented evidence of his work commitments, and the strategic insights that David had shared with my opposition would allow a competent attorney to develop a much stronger position than I had achieved under David's compromised representation. As I prepared to move forward with both my divorce proceedings and my complaints against David Thompson, I felt a renewed sense of determination and confidence. The betrayal that had devastated me emotionally had also provided me with powerful weapons for achieving justice on multiple fronts. David Thompson had underestimated my intelligence, my determination, and my willingness to fight for what was right. He had assumed that I would quietly accept his inadequate representation rather than investigate the reasons for his changing behavior. He had believed that his reputation and resources would protect him from any consequences for his unethical conduct. He was about to learn that he had made the biggest mistake of his legal career, and that the evidence I possessed would be more than sufficient to destroy the reputation he had built through years of betraying the clients who trusted him most. The moment of reckoning came 6 weeks later, when I walked into the Colorado State Bar Association's disciplinary hearing, with a briefcase full of evidence that would end David Thompson's career and secure justice for every client he had betrayed. But before that satisfying conclusion, I had to rebuild my entire legal strategy from the ground up, while simultaneously preparing for a battle that would expose one of Denver's most prominent attorneys as a fraud. Finding new legal representation proved easier than I had anticipated once word spread through the Denver legal community about David's unethical conduct. Jennifer Walsh had connected me with Robert Hayes, a family law attorney who specialized in taking over cases from compromised representation. Robert had built a practice around helping clients who had been poorly served by their initial attorneys, and he was particularly interested in cases involving professional misconduct. When I met with Robert for the first time, bringing both my recordings of David's conversations and Jennifer's documented evidence of his betrayal, Robert's reaction was immediate and decisive. "This is one of the most egregious cases of attorney misconduct I've ever encountered," he said after reviewing the materials for over an hour. "David Thompson didn't just fail to represent you adequately. He actively worked against your interests while collecting fees for services he never intended to provide." Robert's office was a stark contrast to David's gleaming high-rise suite. Located in a converted historic building near the state capitol, Robert's practice felt authentic and unpretentious. His desk was cluttered with case files that showed actual use, and his bookshelves contained legal volumes that were clearly reference materials rather than status symbols. When he spoke about legal strategy, his focus was entirely on achieving results for his clients rather than impressing them with his reputation or connections. "I've been practicing family law for 15 years, Robert explained as he organized my documents into systematic piles. "I've seen attorneys get distracted by lucrative cases, and I've seen attorneys make mistakes under pressure. But I've never seen anything like this systematic betrayal of fiduciary duty. David didn't just drop the ball on your case. He deliberately punctured it to prevent you from winning." Robert's analysis of the evidence confirmed what I had suspected. David's behavior constituted multiple violations of professional ethics that warranted both disciplinary action and civil liability. "We have documentation of conflicts of interest, breach of fiduciary duty, violation of attorney-client privilege, and coordination with opposing counsel," Robert explained. "Any one of these violations would be serious. Together, they represent a pattern of conduct that could result in disbarment." The audio recordings I had made of my conversations with David were particularly valuable because they captured his contradictory advice in his own voice. Most disciplinary cases rely on conflicting testimony about what was said in private meetings, Robert noted. These recordings eliminate any ambiguity about David's changing position on your case strategy. Robert played back several key segments of my recorded conversations, highlighting the dramatic shift in David's advocacy approach. In early recordings, David's voice carried conviction and determination, as he outlined aggressive strategies for challenging Kevin's financial disclosures and securing primary custody. In later recordings, the same voice sounded distracted and passive, as he encouraged acceptance of unfavorable terms without providing any justification for the strategic reversal. "Listen to the difference in his tone and engagement level," Robert said as he compared recordings from different time periods. "In March, he's asking detailed questions about your children's schedules and your business operations. By May, he's giving generic responses that could apply to any divorce case. The recordings show exactly when he stopped caring about your individual circumstances." But Robert was equally excited about the opportunities that David's misconduct had created for rebuilding my divorce case. "The research that David suppressed, the strategic insights he shared with your husband's attorney, and the evidence he concealed all give us tremendous advantages," Robert said. "We can essentially start over with information that your ex-husband believes you don't have access to." The suppressed financial analysis that Jennifer had provided revealed that Kevin's actual compensation was nearly 40% higher than what he had disclosed. His stock options, bonus structures, and benefits package created a total compensation profile that would justify significantly higher support obligations than what he had been claiming. Robert spread out the financial documents across his conference table, creating a visual comparison between Kevin's reported income and his actual earning capacity. "Look at these stock option schedules," Robert said, pointing to complex charts that David's firm had prepared but never shared with me. "Your husband's equity compensation alone is worth more than the total income he reported for last year." The analysis went beyond just current compensation to project Kevin's earning trajectory over the next decade. His company had gone public just 18 months earlier, and his stock options would vest according to a schedule that would dramatically increase his net worth over time. "Family courts consider future earning capacity when calculating support obligations," Robert explained. David had evidence that Kevin's income would likely triple within 5 years, but he never used that information to argue for higher support payments. Kevin's travel schedule was another area where David had suppressed evidence that would have strengthened my custody case. Jennifer's documentation included investigative reports showing that Kevin's company was expanding their international operations, which would require increased travel rather than the reduced schedule he had promised during settlement negotiations. "Your husband's attorney built their entire custody argument around Kevin's claims that he would be more available for parenting responsibilities," Robert said. "We have internal company documents showing that his division is actually being tasked with opening new offices in Asia and Europe. He'll be traveling more in the next 2 years than he has in the previous 5. Robert immediately filed motions to reopen discovery in my divorce case, citing newly available evidence that had been concealed during the initial proceedings. The motion included carefully selected portions of Jennifer's documentation that proved David had possessed but failed to share crucial information about Kevin's finances and work obligations. The legal filing was a masterpiece of strategic positioning that simultaneously advanced my divorce case while building the foundation for disciplinary action against David. "We're not just asking the court to consider new evidence," Robert explained. "We're documenting a pattern of attorney misconduct that materially affected the proceedings." Kevin and his attorney were clearly caught off guard by the renewed aggressive approach to my case. Michael Rodriguez had grown accustomed to David's passive representation and the easy victories it had provided. Suddenly facing a competent attorney armed with previously hidden evidence, Rodriguez found himself scrambling to respond to challenges he had never expected to face. "Mr. Rodriguez called me within hours of receiving our discovery motions," Robert told me with obvious satisfaction. "He wanted to know where this new information was coming from, and suggested that we should maintain the, quote, collaborative approach that had been working so well. I told him that collaboration was over and that we were prepared to litigate every aspect of this case aggressively." The shift in negotiating dynamics was immediately apparent. Kevin, who had been confident about securing favorable terms based on David's passive advocacy, suddenly found himself facing the prospect of a prolonged legal battle with an attorney who was actually fighting for my interests. Rodriguez's first response was to question the legitimacy of the new evidence, suggesting that it had been obtained through improper means. "He's trying to argue that we can't use information that David should have shared with you months ago," Robert explained. "It's a desperate strategy that won't hold up under scrutiny." Robert's response to Rodriguez's challenges was swift and decisive. He filed additional motions documenting David's failure to conduct adequate discovery and his breach of duty to investigate Kevin's financial circumstances thoroughly. "We're essentially putting David's incompetence on trial alongside your divorce case," Robert said. "Every attempt by Kevin's attorney to exclude evidence will highlight David's professional failures. While Robert rebuilt my divorce strategy, I simultaneously pursued formal complaints against David Thompson through multiple channels. The Colorado State Bar Association's disciplinary process was the most important venue, but I also filed complaints with the local bar association and explored potential civil litigation for malpractice and fraud. The state bar investigation moved more quickly than I had anticipated, largely because Jennifer Walsh's documentation provided clear evidence of misconduct that would normally take months to uncover. Your case is extremely well documented, the investigating attorney told me during our initial meeting. Most disciplinary cases rely on he said, she said disputes about attorney performance, but you have audio recordings and internal firm documents that prove deliberate misconduct. Sarah Brennan, the senior attorney handling my disciplinary complaint, was a 20-year veteran of the State Bar's Enforcement Division. Her reputation for thorough investigation and fair judgment had earned respect throughout Colorado's legal community. When she reviewed my evidence against David, her usually composed demeanor showed signs of genuine shock. In 2 decades of investigating attorney misconduct, I've rarely seen documentation this comprehensive, Sarah told me. Most clients don't think to record their conversations with attorneys, and they certainly don't have access to internal firm documents. Your evidence eliminates the ambiguity that usually complicates these cases. The investigating attorney was particularly interested in the evidence that David had been sacrificing multiple clients to benefit Victoria Sterling. If we can prove that this was a systematic pattern rather than an isolated incident, it could result in the most significant disciplinary action our office has pursued in recent years, she explained. Sarah assigned a team of investigators to examine every case David had handled during the period when Victoria Sterling was his client. The investigation would determine whether other clients had experienced similar patterns of declining advocacy and whether David's misconduct extended beyond the cases that Jennifer had documented. "We're looking at approximately 40 cases that overlapped with the Sterling matter," Sarah explained. "If even a quarter of those clients experienced compromised representation, we're dealing with a systematic scheme to defraud clients rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment." The scope of the investigation required coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies and professional organizations. The Colorado Attorney General's office opened a parallel investigation into potential criminal fraud charges. The American Bar Association was notified about possible violations of national ethical standards that could affect David's ability to practice in other states. Jennifer Walsh's cooperation with the investigation was crucial for establishing the broader pattern of David's unethical behavior. She provided testimony and documentation about at least 4 other clients whose cases had been compromised to avoid interference with the Sterling divorce. Each case followed a similar pattern: aggressive initial advocacy followed by sudden passivity once David determined that zealous representation might create complications for his most lucrative client. Ms. Walsh's testimony is particularly credible because she documented these patterns in real time, Sarah explained. She wasn't creating records after the fact to support a particular narrative. She was contemporaneously noting her concerns about David's changing approach to multiple cases. Jennifer had maintained detailed logs of David's instructions regarding case management, billing practices, and client communications. Her records showed that David had explicitly told staff members to minimize time spent on certain cases and to avoid any legal strategies that might establish precedents conflicting with Victoria Sterling's interests. There's one memo where David specifically instructs the entire staff to avoid filing motions that might result in published court opinions about business owner custody rights, Jennifer testified. He was worried that favorable precedents for other clients might be cited against Victoria Sterling in her proceedings. The systematic nature of David's scheme became clear as the investigation uncovered evidence of his decision-making process for prioritizing cases. He had created internal classifications that ranked clients based on fee potential, with specific instructions for managing lower-priority cases to avoid interference with premium clients. David essentially turned his law firm into a pyramid scheme, where clients at the bottom subsidized enhanced services for clients at the top, Sarah concluded. He was collecting full fees from multiple clients while providing premium representation only to those who generated the highest revenue. The state bar investigation also uncovered financial records that supported the evidence of David's motivation for betraying his clients. Victoria Sterling had indeed paid David over $200,000 in base fees, with additional contingency payments that brought his total compensation from her case to nearly $500,000. The fee arrangement represented more income than David typically earned in an entire year from his regular caseload. The financial incentive for Mr. Thompson's misconduct was extraordinary, Sarah concluded. He was willing to sacrifice the interests of multiple clients to protect a single fee arrangement that was worth more than his normal annual income. But the investigation revealed even more disturbing details about David's financial motivations. He had borrowed heavily to fund expansion of his law firm, including the lease on his expensive downtown office space and the hiring of additional associates. The debt obligations had created pressure to generate immediate revenue that made Victoria Sterling's massive fee arrangement irresistible. David was essentially gambling his other clients' interests to pay for business expansion that he couldn't afford, Sarah observed. He needed Sterling's fees to cover his overhead and debt payments, so he sacrificed everyone else to secure that income. As the disciplinary investigation progressed, other victims of David's misconduct began coming forward with similar stories. Word of the investigation had spread through the legal community, and women who had received inadequate representation from David during the period of the Sterling case reached out to share their experiences. Sarah Mitchell, a restaurant owner who had hired David to handle her divorce from an executive at a major corporation, described patterns identical to what I had experienced. David started out very aggressive, talking about fighting for everything I deserved, Sarah told the investigating committee. But after a few weeks, he completely changed his approach and started encouraging me to accept terms that were obviously unfavorable. Sarah's case involved a restaurant business that she had built from a single location into a successful chain of 5 establishments. Her ex-husband had contributed minimal effort to the business development, but was claiming half its value based on theoretical contributions and support. David had initially promised to challenge these claims aggressively, but eventually advised Sarah to accept a settlement that gave her ex-husband 40% of the business value. I kept asking David why we weren't challenging my ex-husband's inflated claims about his contributions to the business, Sarah testified. David would give me generic answers about the costs of litigation and the unpredictability of court decisions. I felt like he wasn't really listening to the specifics of my situation. Sarah had also noticed David's sudden unavailability and distracted behavior during what should have been crucial phases of her case. He missed deadlines, failed to challenge obviously false information from my ex-husband, and seemed more interested in ending my case quickly than getting me a fair settlement, she explained. The settlement that David had encouraged Sarah to accept was later revealed to be significantly below what she should have received based on Colorado's business valuation standards. An independent analysis conducted during the disciplinary investigation showed that David's passive advocacy had cost Sarah approximately $300,000 in business equity. Lisa Chen, an architect whose divorce had overlapped with the Sterling case, had an even more damaging story about David's conduct. My ex-husband's attorney made arguments that seemed to come directly from information about my business and financial situation that only David could have known, Lisa testified. I think David was sharing confidential information about my case to help other attorneys develop strategies against businesswomen seeking primary custody. Lisa's suspicions were confirmed when the investigation uncovered email communications between David and opposing counsel in multiple cases. The emails showed that David had been providing strategic advice to attorneys representing his own clients' ex-husbands, essentially coaching the opposition on how to defeat the women who were paying him for representation. There's one email chain where David advises another attorney about arguments that would be most effective against businesswomen seeking primary custody, Sarah Brennan explained. He specifically mentions strategies that worked against his own clients and suggests ways to exploit their priorities and concerns. The violation of attorney-client privilege represented the most serious aspect of David's misconduct because it involved deliberate betrayal of confidential information for personal benefit. Attorneys are required to maintain absolute confidentiality about client communications and strategic information, Sarah explained. David was essentially selling his clients' secrets to their opponents. The accumulating testimony from multiple victims created an overwhelming case against David that extended far beyond my individual situation. The state bar was dealing with evidence of systematic misconduct that had harmed numerous clients over an extended period of time. Rebecca Thompson, a software consultant whose divorce had concluded just before the Sterling case began, provided crucial testimony about the dramatic change in David's approach to similar cases. I received excellent representation from David that resulted in a very favorable settlement, Rebecca testified. But when I recommended him to other women going through divorces, they had completely different experiences that made me question whether we were talking about the same attorney. Rebecca's positive experience with David served as a baseline for measuring how dramatically his representation had deteriorated once he began prioritizing the Sterling case over his other clients. The David Thompson who represented me was thorough, aggressive, and completely focused on achieving the best possible outcome, Rebecca said. The David Thompson that my friends described sounded like a different person entirely. The contrast between David's early competent representation and his later systematic client abandonment provided powerful evidence that his misconduct was deliberate rather than the result of declining skills or overwhelming caseload pressures. Meanwhile, my own divorce case was proceeding toward a resolution that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Armed with the suppressed evidence about Kevin's finances and the strategic insights that David had shared with opposing counsel, Robert was able to negotiate from a position of strength that transformed the entire dynamic of our settlement discussions. Kevin's attorney knows that we have evidence of financial disclosures that were deliberately misleading, Robert explained during one of our strategy sessions. He also knows that we can prove Kevin's work obligations are increasing rather than decreasing, which undermines their entire custody argument. They're facing the prospect of a trial where their credibility will be completely destroyed. Robert's approach to negotiations was methodical and relentless. Rather than accepting Kevin's initial positions as starting points for compromise, Robert challenged every assumption and demanded documentation for every claim. The contrast with David's passive approach was stark and immediately effective. We're not just negotiating for better terms, Robert explained. We're rebuilding your case from the ground up based on accurate information and competent legal strategy. The difference in outcomes will be dramatic. The pressure of defending against well-documented challenges to Kevin's position led to a series of settlement offers that grew progressively more favorable to my interests. Kevin's initial proposal of minimal custody and limited support was replaced by offers that acknowledged my role as primary caretaker and Kevin's actual earning capacity. Robert documented each offer carefully, creating a record that showed how effective advocacy could produce dramatically different results, even with the same underlying facts. We're now receiving offers that are better than what we initially demanded, Robert told me with obvious satisfaction. This is what happens when you have competent representation backed by solid evidence. The other side knows they can't win, so they're trying to minimize their losses through settlement. Kevin's attorney, Michael Rodriguez, was clearly struggling to adapt to the new reality of facing competent opposition. His strategy had been built around David's passive advocacy and the expectation that I would accept unfavorable terms rather than fight for what I deserved. Rodriguez keeps asking me to reconsider our adversarial approach and return to the collaborative discussions that were supposedly working so well, Robert reported. He doesn't seem to understand that collaboration only works when both sides are negotiating in good faith. Robert's response was to increase pressure on Kevin's position by filing additional motions that highlighted the weaknesses in his financial disclosures and custody arguments. Every motion we file forces them to respond with documentation they don't want to provide, Robert explained. The more they have to defend their positions, the more obvious it becomes that they were built on false information. The discovery process revealed additional evidence of Kevin's attempts to manipulate The financial aspects of our divorce. His company's stock option records showed vesting schedules that would significantly increase his compensation over the next several years. His travel expense reports documented international trips that contradicted his claims about reduced work obligations. Kevin and his attorney were counting on David's incompetence to prevent this information from coming to light, Robert observed. Now that we have competent representation, their entire strategy is collapsing. The custody evaluation that Robert requested provided additional confirmation of Kevin's limited involvement in our children's daily lives. The evaluator's report documented my role as primary caretaker and highlighted Kevin's lack of knowledge about Sophie and Jake's schedules, medical needs, and educational requirements. The custody evaluator was shocked by the difference between Kevin's claims about his parenting involvement and the actual evidence of his participation, Robert reported. She specifically noted that Kevin couldn't answer basic questions about the children's daily routines or current challenges. Sophie and Jake's own preferences also played a crucial role in the custody determination. Both children expressed strong desires to maintain their primary residence with me while having regular but limited visitation with their father. The children understand that their father loves them, but they also recognize that you've been their primary source of stability and daily care, the evaluator concluded. The final settlement agreement secured primary custody of Sophie and Jake for me, with Kevin receiving alternating weekend visitation and specified weekday time that accommodated his actual work schedule, rather than his fictional promises about increased availability. The financial arrangements included spousal support based on Kevin's true earning capacity, plus a property division that accounted for my business value without forcing me to liquidate assets to buy out Kevin's share of our home. This outcome is approximately 3 times better than what David Thompson was encouraging you to accept, Robert calculated. His inadequate representation would have cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars over time, plus the immeasurable damage of losing primary custody of your children. The contrast between the settlement Robert achieved and the terms David had been pressuring me to accept was staggering. Instead of the minimal custody and limited support that David had suggested were realistic, I received primary custody with substantial ongoing support that reflected Kevin's actual earning capacity. David's advice would have left you financially struggling while Kevin benefited from hidden income and reduced parental responsibilities, Robert concluded. The settlement we achieved protects both your immediate needs and your long-term financial security. But the most satisfying victory came when the Colorado State Bar Disciplinary Committee released its findings about David Thompson's professional conduct. The committee found that David had violated multiple ethical rules through his systematic sacrifice of client interest to benefit a more lucrative case. The violations included conflicts of interest, breach of fiduciary duty, failure to provide competent representation, and improper disclosure of confidential client information. Mr. Thompson's conduct represents a fundamental betrayal of the trust that clients place in their attorneys, the disciplinary committee wrote in its published decision. His willingness to sacrifice multiple clients' interests for personal financial gain demonstrates a pattern of misconduct that is incompatible with the practice of law. The committee's investigation had uncovered evidence of David's misconduct, affecting at least 12 different clients over an 18-month period. Each case showed similar patterns of declining advocacy once David determined that aggressive representation might interfere with the Sterling case. The scope and systematic nature of Mr. Thompson's misconduct is unprecedented in this jurisdiction, the disciplinary committee noted. He created and implemented a deliberate scheme to provide substandard representation to multiple clients, while collecting full fees for services he never intended to deliver. The committee's sanctions were severe and comprehensive. David was suspended from practicing law for 3 years, with reinstatement contingent on completion of extensive ethics training and demonstration of rehabilitation. He was also required to pay substantial fines and provide restitution to clients who had been harmed by his misconduct. The sanctions reflect the seriousness of Mr. Thompson's violations and the need to protect the public from future misconduct, the committee explained. His behavior damaged not only his individual clients, but also public confidence in the legal profession. The disciplinary decision was published in the Colorado Bar Journal and distributed to legal publications throughout the state. David's misconduct became a case study in legal ethics courses and professional responsibility training programs. But the professional sanctions were only part of David's accountability. The evidence that Jennifer Walsh had provided also supported civil litigation for malpractice and fraud. Robert helped me file a lawsuit seeking damages for the inadequate representation that had nearly cost me custody of my children and hundreds of thousands of dollars in financial settlements. Civil litigation will take longer than the disciplinary process, but it will provide financial compensation for the harm David caused, Robert explained. The evidence of his deliberate misconduct makes this a very strong case for substantial damages. The malpractice lawsuit was particularly important because it would establish legal precedent for holding attorneys accountable when they sacrifice client interests for more lucrative cases. Your case could change how attorney misconduct is addressed in Colorado, Robert told me. It will send a clear message that attorneys cannot treat clients as disposable revenue sources. The civil litigation proceeded on multiple theories of liability, including professional malpractice, breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Each theory was supported by extensive documentation of David's deliberate misconduct and the resulting harm to my interests. We're not just seeking compensation for the financial losses David caused, Robert explained. We're also pursuing damages for the emotional distress of being betrayed by someone you trusted with your family's future. The publicity surrounding David's disciplinary action and the related civil litigation had immediate effects on his law firm and reputation. Thompson & Associates lost several major clients who were concerned about the firm's ethical standards. Several attorneys left the firm to avoid association with David's misconduct. The firm's marketing materials, which had prominently featured David's reputation and case results, had to be completely revised to downplay his role in the practice. David Thompson went from being one of Denver's most prominent family law attorneys to being a cautionary tale about professional ethics, Robert observed. His willingness to betray client trust for short-term financial gain destroyed a career that took decades to build. The impact on David's personal finances was equally devastating. The disciplinary fines, restitution payments, and legal fees associated with defending against multiple lawsuits consumed the profits from the Sterling case that had motivated his misconduct. The suspension from practice eliminated his ability to generate income from legal work, while the damage to his reputation made it unlikely that he could rebuild his practice even after reinstatement. David's scheme to maximize short-term profits by sacrificing client interests ultimately cost him everything, Robert noted. The fees he earned from betraying his clients weren't enough to compensate for the losses he suffered from being held accountable. Victoria Sterling's case, the massive fee arrangement that had motivated David's betrayal of other clients, ultimately concluded with results that were reportedly disappointing for both Sterling and David. News reports suggested that the settlement was significantly lower than expected, partly because David's ethical problems had created complications and delays that weakened Sterling's negotiating position. David's misconduct ended up hurting even the client he was trying to favor, Robert noted with irony. His ethical violations became public knowledge during the final stages of Sterling's divorce, which gave her husband's attorneys ammunition to question David's credibility and competence. The complete collapse of David's reputation and practice provided a sense of poetic justice that exceeded my expectations for accountability. He had betrayed multiple clients in pursuit of a fee arrangement that ultimately delivered less than promised, while destroying his ability to practice law. Jennifer Walsh, whose courage in exposing David's misconduct had made justice possible, found new employment with a firm that valued her integrity and ethical standards. Doing the right thing cost me a job, but it gave me back my self-respect, Jennifer told me when we met for coffee several months after David's disciplinary hearing. I couldn't continue working for someone who was stealing from the clients who trusted him most. Jennifer's decision to become a whistleblower had required significant personal courage because David had initially threatened to blacklist her from employment with other Denver law firms. He told me that no one would hire a paralegal who betrayed her employer's confidences, Jennifer recalled. But once the evidence of his misconduct became public, other firms realized that I was the one with integrity. The experience had also transformed Jennifer's approach to her professional responsibilities. I learned that loyalty to an employer doesn't mean covering up unethical behavior, she explained. My real obligation was to the clients who were being harmed by David's betrayal of their trust. The other victims of David's misconduct also achieved better outcomes once they were armed with evidence of his betrayal. Sarah Mitchell reopened her divorce case and secured significantly improved terms that recovered most of the business value she had lost through David's inadequate representation. Lisa Chen filed her own malpractice lawsuit that resulted in substantial compensation for David's violation of attorney-client privilege. Every victory created precedent and momentum for holding attorneys accountable for systematic client abandonment, Robert observed. David's misconduct backfired because it created a coalition of victims who could expose his entire scheme. Each successful case against David established legal precedents that would make it easier for future victims of attorney misconduct to seek redress. The documentation methods I had developed became templates for other clients who suspected they were receiving inadequate representation. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that David Thompson's betrayal had ultimately made me stronger and more resilient than I had ever been before. His misconduct had forced me to develop skills in legal research, evidence, documentation, and strategic thinking that I never would have acquired through normal divorce proceedings. You've become one of the most knowledgeable non-attorneys I've ever worked with, Robert told me as we concluded the final aspects of my case. David's betrayal taught you more about family law and legal strategy than most people learn in law school. The skills I had developed during my fight against David's misconduct proved valuable in other areas of my life as well. My marketing business benefited from the analytical and investigative abilities I had acquired. My relationships with clients and vendors became more professional and systematic because I had learned the importance of documentation and verification. David inadvertently turned you into a much more sophisticated business owner, Robert observed. His betrayal taught you skills that will serve you well for the rest of your life. The recordings I had made of David's conversations, initially created as protection against his declining advocacy, had become powerful tools for educating other women about the warning signs of attorney misconduct. I began speaking at workshops for divorcing women about how to recognize when their legal representation was compromised and what steps they could take to protect themselves. Your documentation methods and willingness to challenge inadequate representation have helped dozens of other women avoid similar betrayals, Robert observed. David's misconduct ultimately backfired because it created an advocate who could expose the entire system of client abandonment. The workshops I conducted for divorcing women became increasingly popular as word spread about my successful challenge to David's misconduct. I developed materials that taught women how to evaluate their attorney's performance, document important conversations, and recognize warning signs of compromised representation. Many women assume that their attorney knows best and that questioning legal advice is inappropriate, I explained during one workshop. But clients have both the right and the responsibility to ensure they're receiving competent representation. The experience also transformed my perspective on trust and professional relationships. I learned to verify rather than simply believing, to document rather than relying on memory, and to demand accountability rather than accepting excuses. These skills served me well not only in legal matters, but in all aspects of my business and personal life. David Thompson thought he could take advantage of your trust and naivete, Robert reflected during our final meeting. He didn't realize that betraying you would create someone who was smarter, tougher, and more determined than he could have imagined. The transformation was evident in how I approached every professional relationship after the David Thompson experience. I asked more questions, demanded clearer explanations, and maintained better records of important communications. The skills that had been forced on me by David's betrayal became permanent improvements in how I protected my interests. As I sat in my home office, looking out at the Rocky Mountains and watching Sophie and Jake play in our backyard, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. Kevin's abandonment had been painful but predictable. David's betrayal had been devastating, but ultimately empowering. Both experiences had taught me that the most important person I could rely on was myself. The settlement Robert had achieved provided financial security that allowed me to focus on growing my business without worrying about immediate survival needs. Sophie and Jake were thriving in the stable environment that our custody arrangement provided. They had adapted well to the new family structure and were excelling in school and their extracurricular activities. Mom, "You seem happier now than you did before Dad left," Sophie observed one evening as we worked on her homework together. "I think we're better as just the three of us." Her words reflected the peace and stability that had emerged from the chaos of divorce and legal battles. The family we had rebuilt was smaller, but stronger than what we had lost. The challenges we had overcome together had created bonds that would last a lifetime. My business continued to grow as I applied the strategic thinking and analytical skills I had developed during my legal battles. Clients appreciated my systematic approach to problem solving and my attention to documentation and follow-through. The reputation I built for thorough, reliable work attracted higher quality clients who valued professionalism and results. The recordings that had captured David's declining advocacy were stored safely in my files, along with all of Jennifer's documentation and the legal precedents we had established. They represented more than just evidence of misconduct. They were proof that determination and careful preparation could overcome even the most calculated betrayals. My story had become part of legal education in Colorado, cited in ethics courses as an example of how client vigilance could expose attorney misconduct. Law students studied my documentation methods as examples of how clients could protect themselves from inadequate representation. Bar associations referenced my case when training attorneys about the consequences of prioritizing fees over client interests. Your case has become a landmark example of client empowerment in the face of attorney misconduct, Robert told me. It's being studied in law schools and professional responsibility courses throughout the region. The educational impact of my experience was particularly meaningful because it would help prevent other women from experiencing similar betrayals. By sharing my story and documentation methods, I was creating tools that future victims could use to protect themselves and hold unethical attorneys accountable. The woman who had walked into David Thompson's office months earlier, devastated by divorce and desperate for protection, no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone who understood that true security came not from trusting others blindly, but from developing the knowledge and strength to advocate effectively for herself and her children. David Thompson had intended to use my case as a minor source of revenue while he pursued a more lucrative opportunity. Instead, his betrayal had created his own destruction, while building something much stronger in its place. The justice we achieved was more complete and satisfying than anything his honest representation could have provided. The financial compensation from the malpractice lawsuit, combined with the favorable divorce settlement, provided security for Sophie, Jake, and me that exceeded what I had hoped for even before Kevin's betrayal. We were not just surviving the dissolution of our original family, we were thriving in the new life we had built together. The skills I had developed, the relationships I had formed with other advocates like Robert Hayes and Jennifer Walsh, and the reputation I had earned for standing up to injustice, had created opportunities and connections that enhanced every aspect of my life. David's betrayal had inadvertently opened doors that would never have been available through his honest representation. As I closed my laptop after another successful day of growing my business, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought us to this point. The woman who had trusted David Thompson completely would never have imagined becoming someone who could challenge a prominent attorney's misconduct and win. The transformation had been painful but ultimately liberating. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.